So yeah, hi everyone, welcome and thank you for joining us this evening for a book event for Jesse McCarthy's Who Will Pay Reparations on My Soul, which is out now from Live Right Books. So I'm Rachel Wiseman and I'm the managing editor of The Point, which is a magazine of philosophical writing on everyday life and culture. It looks like this in print. And if you're not familiar with us, I'd welcome you to check us out online at thepointmag.com. We're very pleased to be hosting this event tonight, along with our friends at the Seminary Co-op Bookstore in Chicago. So we're here today with Jesse McCarthy and Lauren Michele Jackson. Jesse is an assistant professor of English and African American studies at Harvard. This spring, while the rest of us were in our late quarantine funk, Jesse came out with not one, but two books. In addition to Who Will Pay Reparations on My Soul, which is the subject of tonight's conversation, he has also just published his first novel, The Fugitivities, out now from Melville House Books. Jesse is also a writer and contributing editor for The Point. So on a personal note, I will never forget when I read Jesse's first submission to The Point. It materialized one day in 2014 in our general submissions box. And I just felt so much excitement at encountering an unmistakably original voice. So that first submission turned out to be Back in the Day, an essay about French hip hop that is also anthologized in this essay collection. Who Will Pay Reparations on My Soul was titled after Jesse's second article for The Point, and it features many other tour de force essays, including reflections on the paintings of Diego Velázquez's slave, Juan de Pareja, Kara Walker's art, trap music, and the Black poetic tradition going back to Sappho. Lauren Michele Jackson is also a writer we've been fortunate to have in our pages, first on what she called Blackness American for our What is America For symposium back in 2016, and then on the religious experience of Britney Spears and Beyonce for our symposium on church. Lauren is a culture critic and assistant professor of English and African American studies at Northwestern University. She is also a contributing writer at The New Yorker. In addition, Lauren is the author of White Negroes, which interrogates the question of cultural appropriation and the trend of Black aesthetics without Black people through meditations on internet slang, Christina Aguilera and Paula Deen. Lauren is also at work on a new book project, A Cultural History of the Back. We're very honored to be bringing together these two writers who are, in my view, some of the absolute best critics working today, and who both seem to share a similar outlook toward culture writing. Whether about music or literature or pop culture, everything from Sappho to The Real Housewives, they approach their subjects seriously and stylishly, but without condescension, bringing the objects of their attention into closer, more vivid focus for all of us. And with that, I'll turn things over to Lauren and Jesse.
Thanks, Rachel.
Great. Thanks, Rachel. Thanks so much. So yes, let's begin. First of all, I just have to say that this is a wonderful book. I think Rachel used the phrase tour de force. I completely agree. And I just really want to start with, the adhesive that is binding, maybe not literally binding, but sort of thematically binding all of these essays together. If you'll notice, those of you who have read the book, right, you date all of your essays. And so I feel like time and the sort of intervening place that these essays arrive is really important to you. So I would love to just hear more about, for you, sort of what is holding these essays together, why bring such a diverse set of essays right into conversation with each other underneath one title and one book.
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me say thank you so much, Lauren, for doing this. I feel like this is sort of something I've been, wishing to do for a long time. As a great admirer of your work, and I want to say also that I'm super excited about the forthcoming stuff that you're working on. So this is just, it's a real honor to be doing this. And shout out to also obviously to The Point and to the Seminary Co-op for setting this up for us. I appreciate that too. Yeah, in regards to the book, you know, it really comes out of these, you know, kind of small magazine articles, essays, and reviews that I've been working on and publishing since about 2014. And I guess I would say in about 2018, you know, I sort of came to the idea and had the opportunity to think about how these might work together as an essay collection, which is always a bit of a tricky thing to pull together because essays by their very nature obviously kind of are, you know, occasional and, you know, kind of tend to the eclectic kind of inherently. But as I thought about and looked over some of the writings that I had done, and also a number of pieces that were unpublished, but involved a number of different topics that have really kind of been, you know, germinating, kind of, I've been thinking about for a long time and wanted to write about. I kind of felt like there was this sense of wanting to try and capture this moment, this period in our kind of cultural history when it feels like there's been a certain number of, I don't know if we want to call them transformations, but sort of almost repeated shocks to the system in general. And a kind of sense of living through a moment of great, you know, historical import. And we can think about that on one level in terms of, at least on the symbolic level, right? The era of the first Black presidency. We think about it also in terms of the resurgence and insurgency of militant Black politics. We can think about it in terms also, I think, of a kind of renewed set of debates, some of them that I think we've seen before, but that have kind of come back with, I don't know if it's even greater intensity, but in different ways around, you know, culture, race, representation, the intersection of art and politics. And I think that, you know, it seemed to me that there was room for, there was a way in which the collection might help to both kind of cast an overall light on that moment. And also, I would say, particularly for me, through the form of the essay, not really come down with a thesis, right? So it's not a book that has, you know, a central argument that, you know, I kind of want people to take away from it, but really actually sort of a set of kind of quibbles and nitpicking and kind of continually sort of asking us to kind of double down and expand the opportunities for reflection that these kind of incidents and moments of tension, I think, produce. And so, you know, I think of the collection hopefully as both being interesting and useful to people in the sense that it gives a kind of feel for how it's been to live through this moment, especially in terms of intellectual history and cultural history. But also, I hope to a certain extent, right, that it uses that as a kind of jumping off point to also try and probe at questions that maybe transcend this particular moment. And so, you know, obviously one hopes always, I think, in writing in particular, in a certain kind of criticism, to both be, you know, absolutely meeting the moment and being in the grain of what people are thinking about and feeling and grappling with at any given moment, and also kind of pushing beyond that to try and get to something that hopefully has a slightly more permanent or lasting impact, or at least potential impact. That's the hope. You know, you never know whether or not you're really going to get there. But I think that was sort of what was kind of driving the idea behind putting the collection together.
Well, I think you got there. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting about the Trump years in particular, and I don't know if this is maybe more widely applicable to maybe sort of any presidential age, but I think Trump was just a certain kind of special sort of coming to for a lot of people. But something that was interesting that I noticed is that it was one of those eras where it felt like people are in such a rush to memorialize it or historicize it, you know, while it's still happening, or have the sort of definitive account of the Trump years. And so you have a lot of books coming out that are like, you know, this is the argument for why Trump won, or this is the argument for the time that we're in, the thesis, right? Whereas what I see in your book is really capturing sort of a mood or like an affect, right, of the age. And why for you is it sort of important to sort of catalog things like moods, things like feelings, things that like are, you know, maybe a little bit sort of less definitive, less, you know, the sort of big marquee sort of account of the moment. Yeah,
it's a great question. I think part of the way I would answer it is that, you know, I think one of the things that tends to push against a kind of, one of the things that tends to push against sort of the potted narratives that get built around X, Y, or Z, and as you said, the kind of thesis argument about this is what the Trump era, even if to a certain extent, if that's even a valid kind of way of putting it, is first of all, right, a kind of you know, the longer view. And the longer view always tends to relativize whatever's going on in the present. And, you know, once you take the longer view, I think you inevitably always tend to see that a lot of the things that people may describe in a certain sense as new, as shocking, as unprecedented, there are precedents for them, right? And there's actually a way in which so much of what we're doing is recycling, reliving, regurgitating things that, you know, we've gone through so many times. I mean, it's extraordinary. I think, you know, right now there's this really bizarre sense of deja vu with the whole, I don't know what we want to call it, the sort of current obsession with folks, I would say, especially on the right, sort of freaking out about critical race theory. And it's like, we're back in the 90s again. There's this strange way in which we seem, you know, unable to move past certain things. And so, I think once you tend to appreciate that longer view, it immediately relativizes these things. And it also, to me, I think, you know, suggests one of the key problems with the other approach, which is that we're all so deeply imprisoned by ideology. And so to the extent that you want to concretize and nail down something, it's very unlikely, I think, that you'll be able to do so without wittingly or unwittingly, to some extent, kind of aligning yourself with an instrumentalization of the moment, an instrumentalization of the history, you know, the attaching of a certain view or set of narratives to a project, usually a project for power by one group or one constituency or one set of interests or another. And to me, I think, and this probably also comes from my interest in the literary and literature, right? Which is that actually the truth of experience, right? The way those years, the quote unquote Trump years, were experienced and lived, bears in the end very little relation, or only a kind of oblique relation, to the way in which it's described when it's being, you know, kind of collapsed into a unit, into an argumentative unit to take up a position here or there. It doesn't matter what, you know, quote unquote side it's for. in a kind of culture war dialectic, or even just in the sense of a kind of convenient narrativizing, just for the sake of comprehension. And this is the thing, is that, like, I'm not necessarily even against that. One, because politics to some extent is necessary. It's necessary to engage in ideological discourse to some extent. And it's also true that, as human beings, we can't, we dislike, I think, living in a kind of state of permanent flux. And so, giving ourselves some kind of set of, okay, this is what happened, and this is what I'm going to tell myself happened, is kind of inevitable. We kind of do that. But I think the critic, and particularly a critic who's interested in a truth function or a truth value that's understood differently, is interested in the difference or the gap in between those narratives, useful as they may be, and a kind of truth of experience that I think we can assume is in fact significantly different from that which has been, conveniently and also conventionally narrativized. And I think that the essay, partly because of its, kind of eclectic nature, especially if you're using it to kind of, not to prosecute a particular point, but to renew a set of interrogations, I think, it has a better chance, I think, of at least shading in that direction. Again, may or may not actually get there, but I think it can be useful in opening up that space.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I found really especially compelling about your book is this sort of consistent motif of a meta conversation about just sort of the genre of criticism and what it's for, and what it can do, what it cannot do, what it maybe is called upon to do a little bit too often, or called to repair or be in service of something that it, sort of maybe can't bear the weight of, but can do other interesting things. And that starts sort of right away with this note on style of usage that you have at the beginning of the book before we actually get into the first essay. And you write, while a robust historical consciousness of this issue, and this is the issue between, or the issue about basically capitalizing the word Black for the audience. While a robust historical consciousness of this issue seems to me essential, my own reasons for adopting a lowercase usage rest ultimately upon principles of tradecraft and precedent. And so I firstly want to know if there was maybe a story behind this sort of note on your own sort of personal style guide here, or just really what inspired you to have this sort of prefatory statement of the lowercase Black.
Yeah, so I actually did it is actually responding to a concrete, problem that I faced, because actually, as the book was being prepared with the publisher, there were these new guidelines that were emitted, notably by the New York Times, but also by, I think it was by MLA, I'm not sure, but at any rate, there were a number of, academic journals that sort of had kind of flipped the switch and said, okay, no, we're gonna, capitalize the B in Black, when it refers to an ethnicity. And, I actually had a situation essentially where, the manuscript had gone to the publisher and it was going through copy edit, and essentially the copy editor had sent it back to me, having capitalized all of the B's across the board, but not only all of the B's, but capitalized all the W's. So every time I said white was also capitalized. And I was like, oh, hell no. I said, this is, I mean, I object, and I could go in, there are a lot of reasons why I object to this. But also it was that feeling of, as a writer, oh my God, this thing that, I feel very strongly about these issues, feel very strongly about the words and how they appear on this page. And suddenly it's out of my control. And same thing, in fact, happened also in in articles right around that time that were going, to magazines that said, well, we have a new editorial line, so whether you like it or not, we're going to take your B's and capitalize them. And, for me, fundamentally, just to be clear, and I say this in my note, I don't have anything against capitalizing the B. And for folks who want to do that, I respect it. I think, it's perfectly, fine to do so. But I think there are two things for me. One, I think that at a minimum, it's perfectly honorable and respectable to do it either way. So I don't think that I don't think we should be, chastising people who refuse to do it, just like we shouldn't be chastising people who insist upon doing it. And the other thing is, I also think that it's deserving of a serious, conversation. And I was pretty frustrated at the way in which I felt like, particularly, I'll go ahead and call them out, particularly the New York Times, really didn't seem to take the issue seriously. They issued a small article where they kind of openly said, we had basically a conversation in our Slack channel about this. I'm like, yeah, okay. That's not actually serious, right? They could have reached out to Black scholars. They could have reached out to Black intellectuals. They could have staged a public conversation around this issue, right, before adopting it, or even decided to adopt it, but then said, because we feel it's a significant change, we also want to accompany it with a kind of rich conversation justifying our choice. And I feel like it didn't happen. I felt like it was just sort of this, we're going to flip the switch now. And it felt a little bit, again, it felt a little bit like it was in response to a certain kind of sense that there was, this was a kind of quick, convenient way for these institutions to respond to a perceived political pressure to do something with respect to Black lives, Black dignity, which I'm all for. But again, I think the way in which it's done matters. And, my line on it personally is just really fundamentally that, I think it's important to look at, again, we've had these conversations and these debates before, and it's worth going back to those. It's worth thinking about, why people made the choice to capitalize when they made that choice. And also, as I point out, and again, to me, it's a personal choice, right? So it's not something that I'm not making this in a prescriptive way and saying, y'all really need to do this, or y'all really need to stop capitalizing the B. For me, I looked at it and I feel like, the New York Times and, MLA style guides, they can say what they want, but I trust that Toni Morrison has thought harder about this question than they have, to be perfectly blunt. I just think that she's somebody who's really mess around with this. And the fact that she both did go through a moment where she was interested in capitalizing, but then went back to not capitalizing, that to me is very significant. I have to think about why she made that choice. And, my view is, and that's kind of why I say tradecraft and precedent. Really there are others as well. She's not the only one who, in fact, has even made that transition. But to me, my thought is, there's I can see the arguments for, I can see the arguments against. Both to me are compelling. On the whole, though, the fact that, I don't think I'm smarter or have thought in a more in a deeper way about this problem than Morrison. And so if it was good enough for her, I think it's good enough for me. And that's kind of what I wanted to get across.
Yeah, I thought the moment of the crossover was so, I think immediate is and sudden, I think is a good way to put it. And I think what for me was kind of disappointing was that it was kind of indicative of the idea that sort of race writing or writing about race, right, is always a matter of politics and not a matter of art and not a matter of aesthetics, right? You say tradecraft, Toni Morrison is the perfect example because, this is someone who thinks so deeply about how words look and sound and syntax and all of that, all of that good stuff that, is so easy to talk about with sort of white writers with the white canon, right? But it gets a little bit stickier when it comes to Black writers. And so the idea that a publication could make such a profound change in the interest of what, like a sort of political statement, right? And that's why I also appreciated, some of the examples you pulled in, right? Angela Davis capitalizes it and then she doesn't capitalize it, right? It's not quite as definitive as, the Black Arts Movement happened and then forevermore, all of these people capitalized Black, et cetera, right? A lot of people went back and forth. There's Black arts era work that doesn't capitalize the B. And so I really appreciated you bringing in all of that sort of historical context and some stuff that I hadn't even known about. And that, on the subject of that sort of bibliography, another thing this book does really impressively is calling in such a wide range of sort of objects and thinkers sort of outside of, the sort of main object of interest in any given essay. And I kind of just wanted to know, what is your sort of methodology around citation? When for you do you know is the sort of moment when you need to sort of really dilate on, sort of secondary reading in service of excavating a primary object, and when do you linger and when do you sort of just alight and move away? Because I feel like your instincts on that are so spot on. But I just wonder sort of how sort of how to sort of scale these things and who to bring in and who to talk to and who to be in conversation with as you're writing.
Yeah, that's such a good question. First of all, I would say, I think there's a way in which when I'm writing, there's a part of me, I wrestle with this, I'll be honest. I wrestle with this a little bit because you don't want to come off as too, how else to put it, too professorial, too academic. Like I actually worry about that a lot in my writing, because it's something actually that irritates me. I don't want to to come off that way too much, but at the same time, I think there's a reflex that I have that comes from my own experience, to be honest, to my experience of education, which is, arriving in college, or even to me, even more saliently, like in grad school, and discovering all of these writers, critics, bibliographies, essentially, as you put it, that like I'd never heard of before. I'm like, why? Like, why did no one ever, how is it possible that like I was never told that these things existed? And I think one of the things that, a lot of, Black writers and critics confront very often is, right, the marginalization of so much of the work within our own canon, right? And so if you don't bring it in and kind of be a little bit, relentless and a little bit aggressive in that citational practice, they stay forgotten, right? Because you really can't count on other critics necessarily to bring them in or remember them. And, one of the things, it's something I tell my students all the time is like, if you really, if you take the time and go to those stacks and you read the scholars, who have, who are carefully, I would say, keeping these traditions alive, you'll find that, there's folks that have written about everything, right? Like there are books about all of these there's such a rich bibliography that's unfortunately so little known. And so I do think there's inevitably a way in which I find myself constantly invested in, pulling in that book that, say, maybe for folks in Black study, we all know that book, right? But there's a lot of people who never had the opportunity to, to take that course, or to pursue that, or necessarily even to, be in that level of education. But they can go to a library, they can look it up, they can go online and order it, right? I mean, and there's a way in which I'm always interested, particularly in this moment, now that we have the internet, we have social media, there's an unpredictability and I think a certain openness to the way things can circulate, that, you know, it can be very interesting and surprising how bringing, you know, a somewhat neglected or minor figure back into circulation can give them really a new lease on life, you know, if you can get it in the right place and people kind of pick up on it. And so I think there's a politics to that for me that I'm very much, you know, interested in, and it you know, it impacts my my scholarship as well, obviously. But I think I also have to say this, though. There's another thing that there's another aspect to this that I think I would want to say, which is, you know, as a graduate student, you know, I was very fortunate to work with, you know, some really magnificent scholars, and you know, in particular, Daphne Brooks was the ended up being the chair of my dissertation project. And one of the reasons why that was so important and so powerful was that, you know, she would call me out, you know, if I wrote a paper that even though maybe I didn't mean to, even though maybe I wasn't really, you know, didn't mean anything bad by it, or what, you know, or something like that, but like had like almost no citations of Black women, right? Like no females, you know, things like that, that like, you know, your blind spot that you're not conscious of, right? That like creeps in and affects that citational practice. And so having that kind of mentorship and that kind of intellectual formation also made me particularly, you know, conscious of the importance of making sure that I'm actively thinking about what I have or haven't included, what the whole looks like, you know, have I thought to check, right, at any time? Now, I'm not saying to check like as in the sense of a quota. I mean, literally in the sense of the intellectual picture, right? Like, are there people that have written about this that I haven't gone to see what they have to say about it? And that in and of itself, to me, I think has been really important and enriching. Again, not because, or not strictly because of a kind of politics of representation in the sense of who gets cited in the footnotes, but actually because it enriches like the intellectual picture that I have, because I've read, you know, I've read scholars and I've read books that I maybe otherwise would have not gotten to, not because they're not interesting or useful, or in fact, precisely the thing that I need, but because of, you know, a just kind of a certain kind of laziness that that you can teach yourself, right, to work against.
Yeah, I also would frequently get the comment of like there's a whole conversation over here that you're missing, that you're not citing, right? Or you know, the, you know, gaps in the bibliography. Do you find because several of these essays have been published, as you mentioned, elsewhere, in places like you know, N+1 and LARB, in the Point. Do you find editors are receptive to your style of citation, to this sort of plethora of objects that you bring into your writing? Do you find that's a thing that does get you called to academic, or is this something that you know, your interlocutors have been really excited by?
Well, honestly, I think I would have to say, you know, and full disclosure, I think we said at the beginning, but right, like, so I am a contributing editor to The Point, small magazine, where I also published. But you know, I will say that I think that, and I think this has actually been true historically to a certain extent as well, that the position of the small publication, the small magazine, which is slightly less beholden, right, to corporate shareholders, to various other kind of that can operate with a certain degree of not total, right, but perhaps more independence than maybe another platform or outlet might have. I found them to be genuinely valuable and important, precisely because they were more tolerant, more willing to accommodate a certain kind of, you know, eccentricity to a certain extent. You know, I think in my case, like, I would say a really good example of this for me would be N+1, the magazine N+1, and the way in which they, I don't want to say allowed me, but essentially worked, helpfully and collaboratively with me to produce Notes on Trap, which is a somewhat unusual piece, right? And it's, that's an essay that, first of all, it took me an extraordinarily long period of time to produce. It took me about 2 years to write. And so just the fact that they were willing to be patient, right? I mean, that's just one aspect, right? The fact they could afford and were willing to wait and wait and wait as I kept not getting them drafts, and then telling them, no, this is completely wrong and I'm going to pull it. I'm going to do something different. This isn't working. And then also being willing and understanding when I came back to them and was like, I've finally figured out how to do this, which is I need to, completely cut and destroy this really long first person, personal essay that I had already written, and take some of that material and add other material and rewrite it using this format that I borrowed from Susan Sontag, right, from the famous Notes on Camp, where that annotated form actually really was crucial to me to be able to approach the subject in a way where it really opened up for me, and changed not only it changed not only sort of what I had to say about it, but I think it actually changed how I listened even to the music and to the culture, and paid attention to it in certain kinds of ways. And so that on that side, I would say, there's definitely a certain gratitude I have to magazines. And one of the reasons why I think they, continue to be important, it's also imperfect as everything is, vehicles for producing certain kinds of work in the public. The other thing I'll say though is, it's interesting to see how times change, when you work with editors. I remember very clearly, I had an incident when I was working on a review for Carol Anderson's White Rage for the New York Times. This sounds terrible. It sounds like I have beef with them. I don't actually have beef with them. It's just these are things though that did actually happen. They came up, and essentially, and right, and this, I think, oh my God, I want to say this was 2015, maybe. I have to go back and look at that to check the date. But I used the term white supremacy in that piece, in this review, and I had an editor from them come back to me and basically like, you can't use that phrase. And they were like, we're gonna cut this from your piece. And I was like, what are you talking about? Like, it was literally in the context of talking about political violence in the era of Reconstruction and redemption, right? I mean, this was not a hyperbolic usage of the term. And I had to come back at them. I went to, I came in with like a huge number of, I wrote like a 8-page email full of, with a full historical bibliography, defining, explaining why I was definitely, either they were going to reinstate the term white supremacy in the context that I had carefully placed it, or I was pulling the piece. And they eventually accommodated that. But I think that would never happen now, right? I think that is, now they're like, you must capitalize your B's. So, a lot can change in a very short period of time.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I'm like, white supremacy is like, Katy Perry says it, like everyone, it's like, the latest sort of like, or maybe not latest buzzword, but it's one of the like 5 words that everyone knows, like you gotta put in your public statement or whatever. And I think it kind of like goes both ways too. Like I think about some of the thinkers that are so important to a good number of these essays, people like Saidiya Hartman, Fred Moten, Cedric Robertson, like Frank B. Wilderson, right? Like these are also people who have sort of changed the conventions of what, academic scholarship looks like, what it sounds like, how it reads. Morrison, again. And so it is really interesting to see, I think people call it like a blend of scholarship and public writing, but it's like, I think it is something different than that. It's not like these two disparate things coming together, right? It's just sort of a way of working that I see in your work and I see in their work. And I have to make sure I ask this. And by the way, I don't know if it was mentioned to the audience, but feel free to send little questions in Q&A if you have them. Something that I really see you working through is, I think this like, or problem of criticism of, or working with sort of Black art, which is this perceived scarcity of ways of talking about it that are available to critics of Black art, which is to say, we either must sort of reproduce an experience of awe and sort of just really just like stare at the thing and amaze at its, or wonder at its sort of existence in the world, you know, against, you know, so much history or so much oppression, etc. Or it becomes sort of like sociological material where it's like we are going to sort of excavate it for, you know, sort of truths of Black life or something like that. And you know, what I love about these essays is that they, you know, you sort of reject the idea that these are our only two options and that they would be so static. And I'm not sure if there's like really a question here, but I think as far as sort of what criticism can do, you know, what is it about maybe Blackness that puts such an added pressure on that question? Yeah, I think that's my question.
Yeah. I mean, so I think this is, again, you know, it is, you're absolutely right. It's this kind of perennial, this perennial vice, this perennial trap that I think we always find ourselves in. And there are many kind of sort of famous, I would say, sort of, you know, dialectical clashes between famous figures in Black writing, Zora versus, you know, Richard, and you know, Ellison versus Baldwin. I mean, we could go on and on. And I do think that I think it's important to acknowledge up front that one of the, you know, I think that the fact that this is a perennial problem is not to say that, you know, we have a kind of, we just haven't tried very hard, right, to think about it. I think that it's genuinely a really difficult problem. And, you know, one way of saying that it's a difficult problem is, you know, that the sense of, I don't know, for lack of a better term, the sense that there's a kind of state of emergency around Black politics, Black life, means that, in the famous words of De La Soul, stakes is high, right? And when the stakes are so high, it means that you're already on this kind of razor wire. You're already, knowing that, you know, the emotions are going to run high. The investments in these things are not ever trivial. Race is in many ways the third rail of American life. I mean, it's, you know, we all can't avoid that third rail. And at the same time, it's, you know, got, 10,000 volts going through it at any given time. And there's this kind of paradox where you both, can't and don't want to get shocked, but also if you're not actually willing to reach out and, grab and wrestle with it, you're missing the whole picture, right? Like you're not even in the conversation because it is at the center of American life. In particular, there's also a global picture, and and that's worth thinking about as well too. But even if I'm just restricting it momentarily or provisionally to the United States, I mean, this is at the center of everything constantly, whether you know it or not, whether you acknowledge it or not. Avoiding it is, to only re-encounter it, this kind of problem. And so, I think it's worth acknowledging that up front. Then I think it's worth also, saying that I think that one of the things that I'm always hoping for is to say, a kind of shallow, you put it in terms of just kind of like being in awe, but a kind of shallow, kind of boosterism, where you're just interested in just constantly kind of promoting for the sake of promoting. I just don't think that's a sign of love, right? Or a sign of care. And I think that, one of the things that I do try and stay attentive to is, even when I have serious disagreements, even when I want to make a pretty, pretty incisive, critical intervention, I want to push back. You can think, for example, about, the piece on Afro-pessimism. I'm not interested in, I don't think that kind of shying away from that is to show love to it, right? I think when you care about people in your family, you tell them when things are wrong, right? Like you actually have to have that conversation, and that's out of love, because you actually care, right? And so I think that is a mode of criticism that is like always going to be difficult, but it's also always worth defending and insisting upon as the better route to go. And I hope that there are ways in which you can do that, such that, for example, it's not about destroying the other. It's not about pulling someone down, right? Like, I have nothing but admiration and respect for Frank Wilderson. And, actually one of the great satisfactions that I have about that piece, which is in the book, but also ran in the Los Angeles Review of Books, is that actually a lot of people, who contacted me and said that they had read it, said that it actually drew them to Afro-pessimism, right? They actually felt like they understood it. They made them want to read more. And that, to me, was part of the intention too. Like, it wasn't part of the intention, yes, was to say, I actually have like disagreements with this, and I think there are problems with this, and I think and these are strong disagreements, but we can have those disagreements respectfully. And also, part of me doing it in the first place, right, is because I actually think this work is important. It is influential. It's been important and influential to me. And this is not about, ad hominem. This is not about who gets to be the important voice. This is not about, and also that we need to be careful. I don't want to go into examples, but those of us who are in this world know about some of the famous examples, that kind of, jousting, it happens in particular in a kind of battle royale way in between Black male intellectuals and academics. There's a way in which it often feels like that's an instrumentalized, situation for the consumption of a certain kind of audience. And I'm very conscious about that as well. It's like, I want to make sure that I'm disallowing that from also happening, right? So I do think that, like, it's always worth thinking about, to a certain extent in this meta way, about how you're approaching criticism, not to pull punches, not to, and also not to just, lavish a kind of, reflexive and fairly shallow praise, but essentially to think about, like, criticism as coming from a place of care and love. But that means, no, like, I'm going to say things, right, that are critical, right? And that's a good thing, because we should want the conversation to continue, right? Like, the fact that there are strong disagreements, it's not a good thing. I mean, it's not a bad thing. It's a good thing, right? That's the sign of a really active, interesting field that's attractive to people, that people want to engage with. I mean, otherwise, why would you care about what's going on in that field, right? If there's no interesting debates, there's no interesting conversations happening there. But I actually think that, like, a lot of the stuff, some of the people you mentioned, whether it's, Saidiya Hartman or Fred Moten or Wilderson and others, Black Studies is producing some of the most, powerful and important and kind of cutting edge theory that's really happening, kind of, period. And so it's an exciting time to be involved and engaged in these ideas. That means you have to engage with them, though.
Right. And I think it takes time, which is also, I think, something that's hard to have, in whatever this age, among social media, right? I think there was, like, there's such an interesting, repetition between, whether it's like debates over Afro-pessimism, or even, I think about the, Beyonce, Jay-Z, is it Ape Shit, I think is the video that was at the Louvre, that you mentioned, where it's like, the video drops and then, you have these really effusive responses that are like, they're inverting, the Western art tradition, or they're fucking with it, or they're just like totally turning it on its head. And then you have, the critics that are like, no, this is like a love letter to like colonialism and wealth hoarding and et cetera, et cetera. And then, sort of out of that, we have, you say, my colleague during St. Felix, who had this, I thought, like really just like sort of beautiful meditative just essay on sort of the various ways that the video is working. And, I think that is the kind of meditative, which is like, not to say that you're like coming down in the middle. I don't think that is necessarily the response. We do have a question from the gallery. So I'll stop rambling. But so the question is, who are some of your influences, and who do you look for, or who do you look to for models as far as writing, essay writing?
Oh yeah, influence. That's great. That's I feel like there are so many. Some that I would be remiss not to mention. There was a kind of wave, I would say, in the 80s and certainly in the early 90s of essayists who were kind of hybridizing or working at the hinge in between Black popular culture and theory and that, this kind of thing. And I think about Greg Tate, for example. I think his fantastic Flyboy and Buttermilk, that collection, or Michelle Wallace's Invisibility Blues, which is, I think, kind of very similar vein, a similar kind of moment. I think also of there's what I think of, it's maybe not quite fair to put it this way, but a kind of belletristic essayism in figures like Gerald Early and James Allen McPherson, Margot Jefferson, Daryl Pinckney. Like there's so many really that I could go to. But I think one of the things that I think is again, like even though I think that people say that there's kind of been this, I don't know, golden age of essay writing. Again, there's so many extraordinary collections of by Black writers and Black essayists that I worry have kind of not kind of gotten their due, right? Have kind of slipped off our radar. That that are really rich, and when I go back to them, I'm always just struck by how remarkable they are, and how unfortunate it is that I think they don't get as much play as they do now. Although again, it all depends on sort of where you're at, because a lot of the really incredible writers that we have out there doing this work right now, they do know, of course, about these, they know their stuff, and they know a lot about these writers and these books. So I don't know, it's sort of always a kind of, it seems again to sort of be this perennial thing. You have a lot of really extraordinary work by Black writers and critics that lives at the margins. It was there then, it continues basically to be there now, even though some of the dynamics around it are changing. I think that it has not changed as much as you might think. And I think for folks who are out there, I think, going back and looking at like some of the great essay writing from the 70s, from the 80s, from the 90s, I find it to be really enriching.
Yeah, and speaking of another question from this one from Warren. You've been instrumental in bringing back into publication the Burn Book by Vincent O. Carter, a book that has been out of print since at least 1983. Could you speak a little bit about the significance of Carter in the Burn Book, to your critical method and engaging in Black life and letters today? And how is Carter's life and work relevant or not to your own writing?
Well, I appreciate it, and thank you for the question. Actually, the book has been out of print since 1973. And Carter himself died in 1983. Vincent O. Carter is again a kind of extraordinary example of a really fascinating story and to my way of thinking, an important chapter, an important figure within I would say sort of post-war Black writing that sort of that fell off the radar, and we actually almost completely lost Vincent Carter because one of the things that happened in his case is that he was kind of part of this generation of Black writers who, like Baldwin famously, like Richard Wright and others, decided to go abroad, to go to Europe, and typically to go to Paris even, in the years after the Second World War. But in Carter's case, he kind of didn't like Paris, and he didn't like the scene there. He didn't get along with anybody, and he kept going, and he ended up in Switzerland. And he basically wrote this book called The Bern Book, which refers to the Bern as in the capital of Switzerland. And it's basically a book about being the only Black man in the city of Bern. And it's very, very funny. It's very witty. It has this very kind of, quality of, something a little bit of like Get Out and some of the stuff that we see more recently, or Claudia Rankine's work in Citizen. But he's already kind of thinking along these lines, right? In the, actually, that particular book was actually written in the 50s. It was not published. He couldn't get it published. It was not published until 70 and 73, but it was written in the 50s. And Carter also, tragically was, he was a guy who had grown up in Depression era Kansas City. And Kansas City had this extraordinary, like so many American cities, had an extraordinary lower class and working class Black community and neighborhood. It was centered on 18th and Vine. It was there was a very celebrated and famous jazz scene out of Kansas City. Satchel Paige and the Kansas City Monarchs, this famous kind of baseball city for Black folk. And that world which he grew up in, was quite literally razed. It was destroyed essentially while he was living abroad in his kind of self-imposed exile in Switzerland. And there's this kind of fascinating thing that happens where he actually comes back because his parents are ill to visit, and he discovers that his neighborhood no longer exists because they built the highway, and they just razed the neighborhood, built the highway, and all the places that he had grown up in had essentially been destroyed. And of course, in its place, they were building, low-rise projects. And we have the Kansas City that we see today, a very bleak landscape. And so he decided to kind of capture and memorialize that world, the world of this Black working class community, in a novel. It's a novel that he wrote. He originally had called it The Primary Colors, but the novel itself was nearly lost. And it was not, in fact, until much later in the early 2000s, that Chip Fleischer, who is owns an independent press, is a white guy, but he's from Kansas City, had found a copy of the Bern Book. He just learned that there was this manuscript that he had written, but that had never been published, and he tried to track it down. And thank goodness, it just so happened that Lieselot Haas, who was Vincent Carter's Swiss partner, was still alive. I think she's in her late 80s now or something like that. And she just had this stack of papers right under, like in a box somewhere. And so Chip Fleischer got a hold of this manuscript, published it in 2003 under the title Such Sweet Thunder. And so it's this extraordinary story of a kind of recovery and retrieval. But again, it's also a kind of case of, both in the case of the Byrne book and of Such Sweet Thunder of the novel, of a kind of a figure who was so deeply marginalized that we really almost completely lost him. But if you go back and look, you can find these people. And I mean, essentially, that's kind of how I came to it. I mean, I was, just came to it by being a grad student in the library and going through, books, in the stacks. And, I was looking, I was just interested. What do we have? What's in the African-American literary section of my library, and just picking books off and looking at them. And I was like, what is this Byrne book? I've never heard of it. Who is this guy? And the more I learned about it, the more I thought, this is an extraordinary story and an extraordinary book that we should really, get back into print. And so I'm very grateful to a number of folks who have helped me to bring the book back into print with Docky Archive Press. And we're actually going to bring back a corrected, there were some issues with it when it came out, but a corrected with Vellum Press that's gonna come out this coming year. So it's been an exciting project, but this is the kind I will say, to bring it back, I guess, to my practice, that I do think that we sometimes don't even realize what a rich kind of body of criticism, of literature, of art, is there. And this is an unfortunate side effect of the fact that, a lot of Black art, a lot of Black expressive, works have struggled, right? Have struggled to gain a footing, to stay remembered. And it's one of the reasons why I say, for Black critics and scholars, it's really important to do this kind of work, and to do the citational practice, because if you don't do it, I wouldn't count on other people to do it. You know what I mean? It's probably just not going to happen. But it's extraordinary how much is there.
Yeah, that just makes me think about just sort of the role of sort of like serendipity and accident sometimes, in work. I think, obviously you have your very deliberate sort of directions, and you're like, this is going to help me talk about this and this. But then you also, walk through the stacks and stumble upon a book, or, turn on the TV and there's, some Turner Classic movie you've never heard of that, you realize does a weird thing. I don't know. I just think like accident is such a, it's such an it's a thing that you cannot plan for, that I think is also becomes really crucial in our work. So we do have another question I think is going to take us home. Let me see. I just lost it. Okay, I just found it again. So it is for both of us, I guess. So you and I draw on high and low or pop culture in our essays, often both at once. How do you think about this distinction in your own writing and culture writing more generally? So a distinction between high and low and pop.
You want to take this one first?
Yeah, I'll go first, and then you can, sort of have a rousing conclusion. Yeah, I think for me, I don't know if I put so fine a distinction as like high and low, but maybe for me, it's more a distinction between like mass culture and, maybe more niche or sort of like avant-garde sort of objects. I think, I don't know, I always feel a little bit like squeaky about the sort of like high, low distinction, because I think it's like, it's like if you like it, and you think you can get a lot of sort of like critical work out of it, then it becomes high. But then if it's like, the thing on TV, right, it's somehow low culture or whatever, when I really think it's just, all television is like mass culture in a way. And so I think being able to sort of name that is really important, because television will call itself things like prestige and art housey in a way that like allows us to also forget that it's doing the same thing that, you know, a CBS sort of crime drama is doing too, or maybe doing a different thing, but it's still the same medium. Yeah, I think for me, I just really write about things that I think are interesting. I mean, it really is as simple as that. You know, whether it's something that people have talked about ad nauseum, or whether it's something I am struggling to find, you know, sort of bibliography for. I think it's just something that is doing something interesting worth talking about is sort of my metric for things that I write about. But much more interested in hearing from you on that question.
Yeah, so you know, this is a hard one for me. So I'm going to say a couple of different things. I'm going to try and say them quickly. It's always hard for me. But right, so one of them is that I do think that like we have a tendency to, particularly in the US, to try and constantly obfuscate class as an analytic referent, actually, that's actually determining our discourse, right, and determining these terms and coloring them in ways that we're trying to avoid actually acknowledging and talking about. And you know, I think, I don't know if I believe this, but I think that there are ways in which different class positions tend, I want to make this careful, tend, I don't think it's an essentialism, but I think they tend to connect to certain kinds of modes of evaluation that have aesthetic repercussions. There's a way in which aristocrats think about, because of the way they think about their position relative to the rest of society, that they also think about value, and that seeps into their aesthetics. I think it's also true of the bourgeois, or the middle class in the middle, and how they think about value, and you know, and what makes something good, what makes something, and how they relate to their class position. And likewise, I also think that you know, folks who are quote unquote on the bottom of the social pyramid, who come out of you know, cultures that are working class, in some cases that, you know, are very tied to, you know, what was formerly, certainly at one time, you know, kind of the peasantry, or the folk at the very close to the earth. They also have a sense of what's good and why it's good, and what culture is for fundamentally. I think these are tendencies. I don't think they're absolute. And I think some of the ways in which we think about high, low, and all of these things, you know, need to be, you know, carefully thought, or, you know, thought about in term, you know, by reintegrating some of that class background, because I think it's real to, you know, and it's worth thinking about. I also would say that, you know, it's always been particularly rich within Black life, because so much of Black life has had a very ambiguous relationship to class, because of the way that race has tended to over-determine the class modality. And so it's very typical. And you think about even like the reaction by folks like Du Bois and people like of his ilk relative to like the young, you know, Langston Hughes, you know, being like, I want to bring the blues into poetry and stuff like this, where, you know, one of the reasons I think people tend to, you know, kind of dismiss Du Bois's critique there is like, yeah, you know, like we've always kind of felt a deep, you know, proximity, and actually a kind of synergy in between the high and the low. We see a certain kind of nobility and, you know, a kind of high art within the blues coming from the bottom, and a kind of way in which the things that we want, you know, to be at the top, we like to get some low in our high, right? And so if anything, the real war is against the middle, right? It's against the way in which the bourgeoisie's values, which tend to be very bound up in resentment against the classes below and above them, you know, are the ones that I think we're also deeply susceptible to. Again, the class background, you know, cuts all the way down and all the way through. But there is, I think, very often in Black life and culture, this this meeting of the high and the low. And I would just, as an example that I think is, again, to pick a kind of somewhat sometimes neglected figure and yet an extraordinarily important one from Black life and culture, but therefore American life and culture. You think about somebody like Scott Joplin. Scott Joplin, arguably, right, is kind of, the inventor of American pop music. I mean, Maple Leaf Rag is essentially like the first American pop song. The Entertainer, like Scott Joplin, kind of creates this template for American pop music, and it's low. I mean, ragtime was being played, it was the trap music of its day, in the same way the blues was. This was stuff that was being played in places where there were people were getting shot and killed, stabbed, and there were bar fights. It was not a refined high world that this music was about or for, was being enjoyed in, right? We know all about the relationship, of trap music to the strip club, but obviously, blues and jazz, a lot of that stuff came out of, juke joints and, houses of ill repute, as we have called them, right? So those were the strip clubs of their time too. But there's also a kind of high that came out of that. And you think about Scott Joplin, here's a guy who on the one hand, produces this extraordinary, like deep in the American grain, wonderful popular music in something like Maple Leaf Rag, but he also produced Treemonisha, right? Which is an opera, which is interpolating Wagner, and he's taking like the Ring cycle essentially and remixing it with the spirituals, with ragtime, right? To produce this kind of really wild avant-garde work that incidentally centers the life of a Black woman, Treemonisha, who's kind of caught between kind of her folk, I would say, inheritance and cultures, but also wants to kind of lift up her community in a certain kind of way and get them to, there's so much going on there, and a lot of class politics going on there too. But interestingly, right, the Scott Joplin that people have remembered is the Scott Joplin of Maple Leaf Rag, and the Scott Joplin who's avant-garde, who's daring artistically, who's ambitious in a kind of high art sense with Treemonisha. Treemonisha was not even produced until the 1970s, continues to be probably one of the most neglected, operas, especially by, a Black librettist. And so, I think we continually have this issue where on the one hand, a lot of Black, art and culture and, expressive form ranges quite elegantly actually in between the high and the low, and speaks to and is involved and confuses the high and the low in really interesting and productive ways. But in terms of reception, people are much more, especially I would say a kind of mass reception, people are much more interested in connecting and keeping connected Black folk and expression to a kind of mass popular and low, quote unquote, positionality, and still somewhat reticent and resistant to saying, oh, y'all can also be like a Black Wagner. Like that's still, there's still a certain amount of resistance to a certain kind of highbrow avant-garde Black art, which is, it's like, well, it's better to just ignore that. We'll just pretend that didn't happen. But it happened, right? And some of these works are really, really rich and really interesting. So there's that.
I think that is wonderful, and one of the many, many things that your book does really is encourage people to go searching and looking and digging and finding those things, both the high and the low. And so I really, oh, Rachel's back. Hi, Rachel. So I will just close off by saying thank you so much, Jesse. Everyone, please.
Thank you.
Get this book. I have to read your novel. I realize I haven't read your novel. You're like,
it literally just came out.
And we didn't even get yet to talk about like fiction. Like you're so busy.
Wow, there's a lot going on.
Lauren, Jesse, thank you both so much. This has been a very, very rich, wide-ranging, very fun conversation. To everyone else, thank you for taking an hour out of your Thursday to join us. And please buy the books. You can get White Negroes, and Who Will Pay Reparations?
Get
Who
the
Will Pay
book.
Reparations on My Soul at the Seminary Co-op or your favorite local bookstore. And yeah, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Rachel.
Take care.
Thank you, Lauren.
Bye.
Thank you.